Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Ana Barillas, and I'm Aurora's Managing Director for Iberia and LATAM. Today, we're incredibly lucky to have with us Agnes da Costa. Agnes needs no introduction in the Brazilian market, but for those of you that may be less familiar with Brazil, Agnes has been the director of the Brazilian Electricity Regulatory Agency, or ANEEL, since December of 2022. And before ANEEL, Agnes worked at the Ministry of Mines and Energy, where she spent almost 2 decades. In her last role at the Ministry of Mines and Energy, among other things, she coordinated the modernization of the electricity sector, the National Hydrogen Program, and worked on policies related to energy transition, research, development and innovation, and international and multilateral cooperation. So, an amazing career and legacy, to say the least. Agnes is also an economist from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and holds a master's degree in energy from the University of Sao Paulo. So Agnes, thank you so much for being here today. I am absolutely honored that you said yes to joining me on this podcast.
Thank you, Anna. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's always very interesting to be able to talk to a broader audience about Brazil, about what we are doing. So it's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Agnes. And yes, you know, when thinking about the topics that I wanted to cover for today, it was quite hard given your very vast experience, but thinking a little bit about both our international audience and our Brazilian audience, I thought we would focus on a couple of key themes. First, kind of what are your reflections on some of the policies where I think Brazil has been a leader globally? What are some of the lessons from other power sectors that you look to when thinking about what the evolution of the Brazilian market might look like, and where the electricity sector regulation in Brazil is going to? Obviously, that's a really interesting topic. So I thought we would get into this with some context of the Brazilian market in the form of some questions, perhaps. So you've been in the energy sector for 20 years or so, as I said, and specifically the public sector covering energy in Brazil. So I guess the first question is, what would you say has surprised you the most about how the energy sector in Brazil has changed in the last 2 decades?
So when I first started working at the ministry, it was really when what we call the new model for the power sector was being established. It was really a law that was approved in 2003. And where we were first designing the first energy auctions in Brazil. So at that time, this model was designed as a response to a scarcity problem that we faced in 2001. We had an energy rationing program. And at that time, 2001, we were really very dependent on hydropower. More than 80% of the supply of electricity was coming from hydropowers. We had at the time some big thermal plants, but not much more than this. And we just passed a phase of liberalizing the sector with introduction of private agents, introduction of competition in generation, granting free access to transmission. So it was really a modern sector model, but we weren't succeeding in attracting investment that would guarantee the expansion of supply in the pace that we needed. So this model of 2003 tried to address these problems. And so the first thing was designing these energy auctions. So the big part of the market was really regulated. So consumers couldn't choose suppliers. They were linked to the distribution utilities, and distribution utilities had to procure the energy. So the design was the distribution utilities had to procure energy through energy auctions. They had to forecast their demand for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 years ahead, and the government would pull all this demand and then design the auction for projects from several sources, then not only at the beginning hydro and thermal, but then thermal with biomass and wind and solar. So this was how we succeeded in introducing a lot of diversity in the mix. And then, as a result of the auctions, all these projects will have granted a concession right and PPAs that lasted for 15 to 30 years, 30 years usually for hydropower plants, and the other more shorter. And so at that time, when I started working, it was really a novelty, and I saw this happening, and we saw with great joy the success of this policy, enabling the sector to evolve in terms of diversifying, in terms of meeting the demand. But something that we couldn't expect at that time is the role of decentralized decision-making. So, because, as I mentioned, this liberalized model came from the late 90s, and it was already foreseen that with time, consumers would be able to choose their suppliers. It's what we call the free market. So we started increasing the opportunities for consumers to migrate from regulated consumers that were linked to the distribution utilities as suppliers to a free market where they could choose their suppliers. And with this, we started seeing how much of the decision-making started coming from this free market. And besides that, if at that time we couldn't see, I remember in 2010, I participated in a working group that was led at the ministry on smart grids. And we were always discussing like distributed generation. And now in Brazil, we have about 30 gigawatts of distributed generation everywhere. And this is something that we couldn't foresee at that time. So, and with this, what is linked to this perception is that we have to shift the way that we design policies, that we plan the sector, that we operate the system, considering decentralized decision-making. And this was not how this model was planned for. And this is why when you were talking about my latest experiences, when we were discussing the modernization of the power sector, it was really like a next level of the same reform. So looking into this introduction of digitalization, decentralization, and those things, how do we adapt all these norms of the legislation, the regulation, to enable this kind of solutions? Because this is also very rich for society when people can choose what they want and think about their business possibilities. So how do we enable it? But on the other hand, how do we deal with allocative distortions sometimes? Because when you have like consumers that were at the regulated market where we were procuring all the thermal power plants that at the same time as selling electricity, and we only procured electricity, so power, megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, were also granting security to the system. So when people migrate from these contracts to the free market, they are leaving a very costly contracts behind. So there is always a smaller amount of consumers having to pay for it. So these were these discussions that were being held since 2016-17 in the ministry, with all the what we call linked institutions to the ministry, which are the regulatory agency for the power sector, ANEEL, but also the national system operator, the manager of our wholesale market, CCE, and also EPE, which is the Energy Research Office, who does all these plannings for the policy design. So this is what I couldn't foresee at that time, and we are there now, having to deal with the impacts of all these changes, and with a slower pace of changes in terms of norms and regulation, which is then really a challenge. So how do we embrace all this new reality, having to slowly change the norms that create the market design?
And I guess that's ultimately a challenge faced by all kind of regulators, right? Is kind of how do you create an environment that can incentivize kind of the technologies that will be a part of the future, and get that kick-started, but at the same time not lock yourself into a mechanism that is not sufficiently agile to adapt to new technologies, to innovation, and to this decentralized decision making.
Exactly.
that you're talking about, and you see that all over the world, I guess. It's a challenge.
In February this year. The IEA organized the first Energy Innovation Forum. And this was the question that I got. So how do you deal with this? And my perception is that we are always behind the pace of innovation, but we have always the challenge to keep the regulation as flexible, as adaptive as necessary. And we have to have to be humble to see that we cannot foresee where innovation is going, to try to predict everything, because it's not really, then we create all these dependencies or all these lock-in solutions. And but it's really a challenge. So it's really doing and redoing. So then when we think about how regulators work, we approved our strategic plan for 5 years ahead. And one of the things is really having this consciousness about being flexible and adaptive. And we work a lot we have like a mandate to look into what we call like a regulatory result review. So looking what we have done, what were the problems, and how do we do it different. So it's really a learning on how to improve the way of doing regulation in this changing environment.
That's really interesting. And again, I guess this is something where I think it's quite common across markets, as I was saying. I guess to turn it a little bit around, in what ways do you think the energy transition in Brazil has been different to that of other countries?
So this is a very interesting question, because some years ago, I would say 5 years ago, when we got this question, we usually would say, oh, Brazil has already undergone its energy transition because we are very clean in the power sector, like 85 to 90% clean energy, renewables, and its majority. And also in the energy sector, about 43% renewable, which is really far ahead than other developing and developed countries. But then we started looking to the fact that we are a developing country, that we have a lot of energy inclusion to do, a lot of energy poverty to reduce. So it's not good to expect that this challenge of increasing the access to energy that grants quality of life to the population in a more equal term won't require more energy. Of course, we have a lot of discussions, programs, policies related to energy efficiency, and also policies and regulations, for example, looking into demand side response. So how do we foster more efficient consumption? But we know that still there is a lot of energy inclusion to be done in a country like Brazil. And for this, we started looking into the policies that we had because of our technological choices in the past, and also because of our really abundant availability of renewables and energy resources. We already have a lot of policies and regulations related to renewable energy in Brazil. But so since 2019, we started looking into all the policies that we have in order to systematically create synergies among them and see that we are all moving towards the same direction. And so when we see where Brazil is, when I talk about the technological choices that we made, I think two are very relevant that are important to be mentioned. So in the 60s, I would say, in the 60s or so, Brazil started seeing the opportunity to develop its hydropower potential. And this was all state-made through state-controlled companies. So we had, I think the first one is Chef in Nordeste, in the northeast part of Brazil. Then we had Furnas in the southeast, and then Eletronorte in the north, and Eletrosul in the south. So we covered with Eletrobras, the holding company, the whole territory, and started developing these very big hydropower project that could supply a lot of great part of the market. And with this, the second choice, technological choice that creates the situation where we are now, is that we developed an integrated transmission system that enabled us to connect all these river basins and hydropower plants with different hydrological systems, in fact. So this was a way of enabling the whole country to benefit of these reservoirs, the water that was stored to produce electricity, maximizing the hydrology, in fact. And the other choice that is linked to it, that is not common in other countries, is that having this centralized operation, we have really an operation system that is also centralized. So, and with this, also the price formation in Brazil is also through this centralized, is a result of this centralized model. So when we operate the system in Brazil, we are looking into minimizing the cost of generation and transmission. And as a result, and looking to what marginal resources enter the system, we get the marginal cost and marginal price in Brazil, which is different than operators, I think, like in Europe, for example, where the operator is really trying to match the bids of suppliers and demand as in the best way it can, but also trying to procure the security that is needed to operate the system. But these are choices that were made in the past that we are linked to them. And when I talk about the modernization of the power sector, these are discussions that are in this agenda as well. Should we evolve to a price formation that is linked to a decentralized decision-making of bids from agents in the supply and demand side? Should we do this? Would this be more efficient? But when we discuss this, what we are talking about is really shifting the risk of setting the premises for the prices from a centralized body to all the agents. And there are several benefits in this and other downsides as well. So these are discussions that are being taken since 2016, more consistently since 2019. So this is one choice. And the other choice, technological choice that led us to where we are, was the Brazilian response to the oil crisis in the late 70s, when we benefit in Brazil from sugarcane industry that comes from our colonial times, and when the prices of oil increased a lot, the government, the Brazilian state, saw the opportunity to use this industry to produce biofuels, and there were a lot of investments done in biotechnology, in increasing the efficiency of crops, and designing and creating a market for biofuels. And what is very good in Brazil is that we are a very big country. I think we have the 7th biggest population of the world. So we have size to enable industries. And one of the industries that were created throughout the years, but most recently since the late 80s, 90s, is in the flex fuel engines for light vehicles. So in Brazil, everybody can fuel his car with gasoline and ethanol in any combination you want at the gas station. So it's really something that led us to have an energy mix that is cleaner than other countries, because we have a lot of biofuels that are really integrated into the market, into consumption habits in the country.
So that's fascinating, kind of, Agnes. And it's really interesting when I think about the Brazilian kind of market and the electricity market specifically. In some ways, it looks like almost every other market in the world. And then you start looking really at some of these idiosyncrasies that you mentioned, right? Like the way that hydro is dispatched, the risk-sharing approach to kind of hydro dispatch, and how central that is to the whole market. And it's really a fascinating kind of market. And to hear kind of how that has evolved, I guess, and what have been some of the key decisions over time that have led it here. I think it's quite fascinating. One of the, if I can continue on along the same line of thought, one of the area in where I think one of the areas in where I think Brazil has really been ahead of the curve, and you mentioned this before, is in thinking about transmission expansion. So where most countries have left this to to regulated monopolies, Brazil has created a regulatory framework to enable the private development of transmission. So the question is, what lessons, if any, do you have for other countries struggling to keep up with the rate of transmission investment, which is really required to enable the energy transition and the amount of renewables needed to enable that transition?
It's a nice question that we have been answering a lot lately. And it's really, if I may say, considering all the challenges and policies that we have, an easy answer. In this case, with the liberalization, we granted the free access to transmission. So when we procure projects in Brazil, we are procuring a project developer that will operate the transmission line in exchange for a concession contract for 30 years and also a revenue. So it's really, it has to be available for the system, but it doesn't, it's not affected by market developments, for example. And then how did we do this? We started designing the transmission line auctions. But what is the difference in terms of planning an auction for transmission than in planning an auction for energy? When we plan an auction for energy, we use the Energy Research Office studies, which are indicative. So they have like scenarios of how several sources can evolve, how the market will evolve, and for the energy auctions, then the Ministry of Mines and Energy selects some sources, some products, and designs the auctions. In transmission, the planning is what we call mandatory. So EPE, together with the national system operator and the incumbent transmission agents, they start looking into what are the modernizations that we need, what are the reinforcements that we need for existing lines, and where is the load growing, what are new projects that we need. So this is really done in an yearly basis. There are several what we call reports that are designed. We call them R1, R2, R2, 3, and 4. And with all these reports, they say, okay, then we have a need of the new lines or the new substations in these areas. And with this planning, ANEEL starts then designing the lots. How do we put these projects together in order to create competition among agents? So we have auctions, for example, that have big lots and smaller lots. And what is one of the results that we got in these designs of these lots for the auction is that we have a lot of international transmission agents in Brazil, but we also started incentivizing or fostering or pushing forward that other agents in Brazil, in the economy, like civil construction workers, apply for smaller lots and start entering the transmission business. So when we look into the year 2001 or so, we didn't even have 10 transmission system asset holders in Brazil. We have the big they were all state controls. We have the far from Eletrobras and some state-controlled companies that had transmission assets in Brazil, not even 10. And now we have in Brazil 349 transmission asset holders that build and operate these assets. So it was not that complicated to design this, but what do we have to have? We have to have a legal framework so when we look into the legislation, we have two laws that are really dedicated to discuss concession rights. And with this, we have then a governance structure that has ANEEL, the Ministry of Mines and Energy. We have a national audit court in Brazil that looks into all the public bidding documents to look that it's really the best projects, the best cost that we consider in order to set the revenue cap for the auction. And so it's really a governance structure that works. Then coming from the law, we have then all the public bid documents, the concession contracts, and a lot of regulation in terms of grid rules and that set the rights and duties of transmission line owners. So it's really designing this regulatory institutional framework and governance that grants stability, I think, to this market for transmission in Brazil, and that is being very successful in attracting investors to Brazil, and also in Brazil from other markets as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think what's so fascinating about this is, the increasing competition that you've had from these transmission holders, as you were saying, because I think one of the challenges that other countries face where this is largely done through regulated monopolies is that monopoly regulation obviously is quite heavy-handed, or tends to be quite heavy-handed, because obviously there's a fear that without competition, kind of unnecessary rents can be extracted.
But Anna, I have to tell you that in Brazil, it's also a very regulated monopoly. And all these 349, they have the monopoly of their assets, and there's no competition there, and we have to regulate the revenue. So they have a concession right, and they have this contract with a revenue cap that is the result of their bid in the auction. But the contract says, usually it has evolved throughout the years, also with the participation of the National Audit Court, that the new contracts I have in a 30-year frame has like 5 revision periods. I think 5 or 3, I think I don't know if 5 or 3, but they have revision periods where we can look into this revenue and look into how the industry evolved, and some parts of these revenues we are able then to review. So it's really very regulated in terms of what are these duties and rights, and how we authorize, for example, these reinforcements, and how we authorize sometimes them to do construction works and get off grid. So there are several rules that have to obey by, and it's really very regulated as well here in Brazil.
No, and I obviously I completely understand that. I guess the point is, or where I was going to is that you have 349 companies to look to as an example of how things can be done, and can be done efficiently or not, right? Like there's a lot of ability to compare and see what works. And I think the inability in some countries to do that, because you don't have 349 transmission holders, you have 4 or 5 if you're lucky, means that sometimes, kind of innovation may be limited, or anticipatory investments, are somewhat limited, because there's a fear that you don't really know whether some of those investments are needed or not, and you can't compare really against other holders.
But one point that you say, Anna, that is interesting, is the role of planning. So Brazil is presiding the G20 now, and we have like an ongoing workforce in 20 countries discussing what several aspects in the energy transition working group of the 320, and ANEEL is participating there as well. And then one of the pillars of this discussion is what we call the financing for energy transition, for new renewables. And when we look into what is behind getting finance or a financing at a good cost, is really the regulatory stability, but the planning. So countries have to know where they are going. And so the discussion now at this ETWG group is how the G20 can help countries to create planning capacity so that investors can, and the country itself, the government can know where it's going, what is needed, but also investors can see these prospects of these investments.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And in a world in where you can build renewables much faster than you can build transmission, then planning is absolutely critical. So Agnes, you mentioned kind of the role of hydro in the Brazilian energy system, and it is clearly one of the key I guess identifiers of the Brazilian energy kind of matrix. And most of that hydro actually has the ability to regulate its generation based on what's required by the system. So in some ways, you have this big, massive battery in the energy mix already, where actually a lot of countries are struggling to build storage fast enough, right? And again, this is one of those things in where renewables have been built so fast that some countries are struggling with the transmission and with the storage part of the equation. So I know this is not an immediate need in Brazil because of the amount of flexibility you have embedded in the system, but how do you think about the need for flexibility in general, and I guess storage in particular, in the Brazilian system in the future, say 10, 15 years from now? Do you think the existing flexibility is kind of enough? Do you think kind of the regulatory or market framework needs to evolve to incentivize more storage? What's your current thinking on that?
I think we are evolving the market design to accommodate other sources of storage as well. But the discussion of flexibility and adequacy is more recent from the same period, 2016, 2019. And when we started with the modernization of the power sector of the ministry, one of the first actions that we took was changing what we call in Brazil the adequacy criteria of the operation of the system, and also for the planning of the system. Because before that, we were really like an energy-only market, only looking to procuring energy, kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, and we were already seeing that there was need of capacity and also of flexibility. So with this agenda, I think all these public bodies started looking into the potentials of new regulations, new incentives, new possibilities. So where are we now? So the first thing is that we changed the law in 2021 to be able to procure capacity to what we call a reserve capacity auctions. There was one first auction that took place, I think, in 2022. And then there is one planned for this year. And this year is the first time that we see the discussion of trying to procure also batteries, so storage for batteries. I don't know if we will be quick enough to be able to enable this kind of procurement for this auction this year, but it's really very close to that because EPE, the ONS, and ANEEL, everybody is working on this. So ANEEL has already discussed several regulations that are linked to storage, and also mainly what is linked to this discussion, a regulation of what we call the hybrid projects. So how does a hybrid agent answer to the system and answer to the regulatory framework that is set? So this is a discussion that is ongoing, but we had some evolvements lately. So then, besides procuring capacity, there is a discussion about flexibility in itself, And one that is being taken here at ANEEL is ancillary services, and we are on the way of launching a regulatory sandbox for the procurement of ancillary systems for tension control for a specific part of Brazil, looking into what are the existing assets, like inverters of wind power and solar power plants that can be applied to supply the system with this ancillary system services, because usually this is done only by hydropower plants.
Exactly.
So we are designing new products, new possibilities to introduce new technologies in the system.
No, excellent. And so, you've talked a little bit about, I think in the course of the podcast, ancillary services, kind of bid-based versus kind of cost-based kind of mechanism, capacity markets. Are those the regulatory priorities for ANEEL in the next 10 years? Is there anything else that you think is in the horizon as you think about the evolution of the Brazilian system?
I think they are part of it. So because, again, looking to the decentralized decision-making on this demand side, but also demand you sometimes being a supply side as well, we have to be more flexible. And when we talk about our priorities for ANEEL, it's really enabling that the regulatory response is flexible and adaptive as needed, because it's really a changing paradigm and changing system and changing sector. So, and then looking into how we organize our work, we have like a regulatory agenda that is looking 2 years ahead. So really, what are the public consultations that we are opening? What are the specific regulatory teams that we are really developing or discussing in the coming 2 years? But then we have this strategic agenda that looks 5 years ahead, and then we have more open-ended discussions. And of course, the adoption of new technologies is really important to be possible through regulation. And we are always looking to removing regulatory barriers that would impede this to happen, and to facilitate new business opportunities, build business solutions, new technologies. But what is our role then? Ensuring the balance among stakeholders, because at the end we have also to look into cost allocation of all this decision making, centralized and decentralized. And then when we look into this strategic agenda, it's really design highlighting 14 strategic objectives. So some of them are really looking into how ANEEL works, more operational and governance oriented. But there are several priorities that are looking to what is important for society, for the regulated agents, and so on. So I can mention some of them. So it's the first time that we put into the strategic objectives of our strategic plan the theme of energy transition, because ANEEL was always looking to electricity. It was not really seeing its role as a part of an energy system. So our first objective, in fact, is called is act for the energy transition with fair allocation of its effects and social responsibility. So this is the first one. So when we look into this regulatory agenda that we publish every year, looking 2 years ahead, we have to be able to see that we are doing this. And then there is something more specific to the work done at ANEEL, that is the modernization of the electricity tariffs. So how do we design tariffs that can encompass so many new behaviors, so many new solutions, but in a fair way? Because when we think about distribution utilities, they are monopolies. We can we always, as economists, think about price discrimination. So we have to avoid price discrimination that in somehow harm consumers. But on the other hand, price discrimination when you give choices might be interesting. So we are discussing the modernization of tariffs, and then looking into discussion, considering economic and social diversities and technological advances. So this is one of the strategic objectives. Another one that I wanted to highlight is Brazil, when looking to the legal framework, everything is linked to concession rights, authorization. So we are, one of the pillars is then to improve the issuance and management of these concession rights and authorizations with a more strategic vision. So how are we doing this? Are we, when we do this in a way, are we stimulating or creating space for opportunistic behavior, or are we not? So these are thoughts that we have to address when we think how we do the things here related to these concession rights. And then another important responsibility of ANEEL is oversight. We call them Brazil fiscalização. We have technical oversight, quality oversight. So these agents are all there. We have a lot of agents now, 342, 49 adult transmission asset owners and operators. We have more than 2,000 generators. We have more than 5,000 free consumers and what we call special consumers. We have a lot of agents now in the sector. So how do we design this oversight in what we call a responsive way? So it's increased the effectiveness of the responsive oversight with a focus on guidance, prevention, and better response to society. Because fact is that we are not here to punish agents, but we are here to give them their correct incentives for them to respond correctly to the needs of society. So we are evolving in the design of this responsive oversight as well. And then one other strategic objective, it's very important, is to improve ANEEL's operational model in states and regions, because in Brazil, energy legislation is a competency of what we call the union, so the federal state. But things happen in the cities, in the municipalities, in the states. So how do we operate more closely to the states and the regions, and then considering all this diversity and also inequalities that exist throughout these regions and states? And then another strategic objective that's important to mention is really institutionalize the ESG agenda in ANEEL. So looking to everything that we are doing, what are the effects in environment? What are the effects in society level, in reducing inequalities, for example? And always looking into how to be transparent, how to be accountant, which is more linked to our governance agenda as well. And the last, there are 14, but the last one that I wanted to mention is also the promotion of the consolidation of our data governance and the distributed development of our IT solutions based on criteria and standards. This is really looking inwards, but recognizing that today, with all the data that we create in the power sector, there is a lot that we can do. And when we talk about evidence-based public policy design, evidence-based regulatory design, we have to be able to use all this information to design the best regulatory responses that we can. So these are the objectives that I wanted to highlight, so that you see that there is a lot of things to be done as a regulatory agency here in Brazil.
No, absolutely. And, I wouldn't expect anything less of the world's 6th largest consumer electricity market. So clearly there's a lot to be done. Agnes, if it wasn't clear from that, I know you're a very busy woman and you have plenty of stuff to do. So I can't thank you enough for joining me today. It's been an absolute honor to talk to the woman heading the electricity regulator of such a large market and such an important one in many ways. So thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Anna. It was really a pleasure from our side as well. I think it's always nice to have time to step back and then discuss the sector and the challenges and our history. So it's really a pleasure. You can always count on me. Thank you very much.
That was Ana Barillas, Aurora's Managing Director for Iberia and LATAM, talking to Agnes da Costa, Director of the Brazilian Electricity Regulatory Agency. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.